very much.
Do you want to add on that?
I'll put my phone on as well. Okay, well, thanks very much for inviting me along this afternoon. And actually, a discussion about the miners' strike of the mid-1980s is one that doesn't really impact too much on trade union law as we understand it. But the defeat of the miners, of course, set the sort of ideological tone for the Conservatives and even for Labour subsequently, and the way that employment law has developed since the mid-1980s, right up until, of course, the Act that was passed last year, the Strikes Minimum Service Levels Act, that will effectively ban strikes in a number of what they call important public services, particularly the ambulance service, border security, and possibly when we see the actual regulations come out, perhaps even in the education service as well. So if we go back to the early 1980s and the election of Margaret Thatcher, well, I know that was in 1979, and the election of Ronald Reagan in America, I mean, many commentators have said that really marked the end of what was called the post-war consensus, where both Conservatives and Labour were prepared to live with trade unions. Trade unions were deemed to be part of the estate, and there was something called tripartism, where the unions, employers and the government would often be brought together to allegedly plan economic policies and social policies and all sorts of things. But Thatcher and Reagan were said to have marked the end of that period and ushering in what we now know as neoliberalism. And that's true as far as it goes, but I don't think many commentators have properly explained it, in the sense that Thatcher and Reagan were adherents to an Austrian philosopher called Friedrich Hayek, who argued in his most famous book, The Road to Serfdom, that unions had an unfair monopoly over the supply of labour and were therefore able to coerce employers to pay wages at a level over and above what the market would determine. And Hayek argued that this use of coercive power was a threat to all our freedoms, and that the state should legislate to take away union power particularly in the collective bargaining arena, where that was most apparent. And so the Thatcher government started to legislate to limit trade union bargaining power with two employment acts in 1980 and 1982. But even before they won the election in 1979, it's been alluded to once or twice already today, her advisors were working on plans to smash the unions, the big battalions of organised labour, not through legislation, but industrially, and to fully use, the point that Matt's just been making, to fully use the state's monopoly over the use of violence to secure their aims. And so we may say at that time, look out the miners, but also look out print workers and look out the dockers in 1989. So although there was this consensus that existed since the end of the Second World War, and Britain was a party to it, it signed up to the ILO Conventions 87 and 98, which guaranteed the right of people to join unions, the right of association, the right to represent our interests collectively, the right to be represented collectively, the right to negotiate and bargain, and a right to strike. So it was no surprise then, after 55 years of this consensus feeling in both internationally and domestically in labour law, that the Labour government of 1974 should legislate for a most extensive package of trade union and workers' rights with the Trade Union Labour Relations Act and the Employment Protection Act and other beneficial rights. However, of course, the whole edifice came crashing down in 1979, 1980, because the neoliberals, of course, had no interest in consensus. The Marxist philosopher Raymond Williams saw the early 1980s as a period in which the most open class struggle British society had ever seen since the war. The apparatus of the state hit the miners so hard, by the end of the strike, all other unions knew that concerted action anywhere to protect jobs or pursue wages would invite the same ruthless treatment. In fact, we had a foretaste of this with the print workers slightly earlier in 1983 with their dispute with Eddie Shah at the Stockport Messenger, which is in Matt's book, and again a year later at the News International plant at Wapping, again, which is in Matt's book. So they carried on legislating against the unions, targeting particularly this so-called coercive power in the bargaining arena. Successive acts were passed in 1984, 1988, 1989, and 1993, designed to protect and weaken, designed to restrict protest and weaken trade unions. The Conservative government stopped workers from acting together in solidarity, criminalised aspects of picketing and protest, and further restricted industrial action. So by the time of Labour's election victory in 1997, the trade unions were assumed to be so weak that they would accept Labour's fairness at work proposals as a substitute for the restoration of collective responsibility for social and industrial justice through collective bargaining. The Labour years not only failed to repeal the anti-union laws, they gave rise to an era of individual employment rights, to which every worker could supposedly benefit from a special status as stakeholders at work. People may remember that word stakeholders. It's very much disappeared from the vocabulary now, but it was definitely something that was promoted by the Labour Party in the late 1990s. So through individual rights, which were given to us, we could appeal to the judicial arm of the state, mainly at the Employment Tribunal, for harms and wrongs that had already happened, dismissals that may have already happened, consultations that may not have taken place, maternity pay not provided, all looking backwards and all serving to limit our reasonable expectations of movement on the collective front. Of course, the promise of even individual rights quickly soured once the Labour government fell in 2010. In 2013, fees for access to the Employment Tribunal were introduced. The volume of claims for employment and workplace discrimination matters fell by between 70 and 80%, although of course the number of wrongs in the workplace did not fall at all. The fees were eventually struck down after court action by Unison. But the Labour government's failure to restore collective rights, collective mechanisms for workplace justice, were assumed by the European Court of Human Rights as evidence that there was a democratic consensus in Britain for heavy restrictions on freedom of association. So emboldened by the idea of a reasonable political consensus on restricting freedom of association, the Conservatives legislated again against the unions in 2016. This further increased opportunities for employers to challenge the legality of industrial action ballots, strengthened employers' ability to prepare to withstand strikes, and subjected workers in the public services to the most restrictive balloting thresholds. So now, at a time when freedom of association is most required, trade union rights are being assaulted once again. The government tried to change the law to allow agency workers to be used as a substitute labour force during a strike, which was struck down in the High Court, but the government is going to bring this back to Parliament shortly. It also changed the law to increase the amount of statutory damages a union could have to pay an employer for supporting a so-called unlawful strike, and for large unions like Unite or the NEU, it's now set at £1 million. And most crucially, it has enacted the Strikes Minimum Service Levels Act that requires unions organised in important public services to ensure that a sufficient number of its members go into work during a strike to ensure that the minimum service is provided. In other words, the government are going to try and make the unions the police people of its members. If you don't know what the important public services are, they're border security, nuclear installations, education, fire and rescue, health and transport. In the event of a strike, an employer may issue a work notice to the union specifying which members of that union will be required to attend work to provide the minimum service as set out in the regulations. Just think about that. The employer may specify which members are to come to work. Well, what employer wouldn't take the opportunity to pick out the shop stewards committee, say, I need them to come to work, and then the shop stewards are confronted with a picket line of their own members. What are they going to do? It's clearly designed to set worker against worker. Under the code of practice, a union will be obliged to take reasonable steps to ensure that its members covered by the work notice know that they must not strike and must attend their work, and pickets must make no attempt to stop these members going to work. Unions that don't take these reasonable steps may be liable for damages claims in the High Court, and don't forget, I've just told you that the damages claims have now been increased to £1 million for the big unions, and members who decline to go to work after a work notice has been issued may be dismissed and have no claim for unfair dismissal at the employment tribunal. So clearly this is an existential threat for the unions concerned. So the question is, and I'm going to finish on this, Chair, if you're watching the time, it's an existential threat for the unions concerned. So how to respond? Well, firstly, ASLEF have shown how to respond. They've responded industrially when the employers said that the LNER, the railway company that runs up the East Coast Main Line, issued the work notice. The union immediately responded by hitting them with 5 extra days of strike action, so the work notice was withdrawn. Or legally, PCS, the Civil Servants Union, is launching court action against the government, saying that the new legislation breaches its members' human rights under Article 11 of the European Convention on Human Rights. Or politically, for example, Sheffield City Council have already passed a motion saying the City Council won't issue work notices if its staff go on strike. And this is something that I might come back to in the question and answer session. Or I suppose you could be hopeful. If you didn't believe in any of the first 3 courses of action, you could be hopeful, which I'm not particularly advocating, and do nothing and wait for Labour to enact its promise to repeal these laws within 100 days of taking office. So, Chair, there are many legacies of the defeat of the miners in the mid-1980s, and one is that it's changed this trajectory of social justice at work, and what it means, who can claim it, and how.